If we think of the lecture on ethics as having the overall point, the overall conclusion that ethics is nonsense, then we can read the essay as a whole, which is, in some ways a really wacky essay. I mean, some of the things that he says are really out there in the sense, later on he talks about the book that, if it could be written, would explode all the other books in the world, and the feeling of being absolutely safe, and gets into some very sort of big issues. But in some sense, the argument towards that main conclusion that ethics is nonsense is a pretty down to earth argument. After an introductory section in which he explains what he means by ethics, he goes into an argument about the different kinds of judgments of value that we make. Judgments of value is just saying that something is good or bad, or better or worse. If I make a statement like the cat is on the mat, that is not a judgment of value. That is a simple statement of fact, if it's true that the cat is on the mat. Whereas if I say that it's a good cat, or if I say that it's a bad cat, or if I say that it's bad that the cat is on the mat, then I've made a judgment of value. And Wittgenstein makes a very interesting distinction between two sorts, what he sees as two sorts of judgments of value. At the top of the second page, he talks about absolute judgments of value as opposed to relative judgments of value. Well, what does he mean by relative judgments of value? Well, he's explained that in his idea here when he's talking about good, and expressions like saying that something is good. Is that sometimes when we use the word good, we use it in a very particular way, or we've said something very particular and concrete. That is, if I say that something's a good chair, he says, this means that the chair serves a certain predetermined purpose. And the word good here has only meaning so far as this purpose has been previously fixed upon. In fact, the word good in the relative sense simply means coming up to a certain predetermined standard. Thus, when we say that this man is a good pianist, we mean that he can play pieces of a certain degree of difficulty with a certain degree of dexterity. And similarly, if I say that it is important, that would be another judgment of value. Important for me not to catch cold, I mean that catching cold produces certain describable disturbances in my life. And if I say this is the right road, which would be another judgment of value, I mean that it's the right road relative to a certain goal. What's key about these relative judgments of value, or judgments of relative value, is that you can eliminate all the value language and just make it replace the value judgment that something's good, or something is right, or something is important by simple statements of fact. He says here, every judgment of relative value is a mere statement of facts, and can therefore be put in such a form that it loses all the appearance of a judgment of value. Instead of saying this is the right way to Grantchester, I could equally well have said this is the right way you have to go if you want to get to Grantchester in the shortest time. This man is a good runner simply means that he runs a certain number of miles in a certain number of minutes, etc. So far so good. And judgments of relative value, or relative judgments of value, are perfectly sensible. And that's because we are simply saying, when we say that something is good or right or important, that it comes up to a certain, let's say, predetermined standard, which is purely arbitrary, really. But that importantly, we can translate the judgment of relative value into a simple statement of facts. Now, when it comes to what he's calling judgments of absolute value, we cannot. Let me see if I can find a place where he explains this fairly clearly. Maybe I can't find a place. Well, when he's talking about playing tennis badly, here at the bottom of page 1. I think that's the closest we'll get to a really clear explanation of the distinction or what he means by a judgment of absolute value. If somebody's playing um, tennis badly and you say, you're playing badly, and the person answers, I know I'm playing badly, but I don't want to play any better, you'd be like, okay, well, if you don't want to play better, then there's no reason to try. Then he says this, though, but suppose I had told one of you a preposterous lie, and he came up to me and said, you're behaving like a beast, by lying. And then I were to say, I know I behaved badly, but then I don't want to behave any better. Could he then say, then that's all right? Certainly not. He would say, well, you ought to want to behave better. Here you have an absolute judgment of value. So that if you say to somebody, well, you ought to try to play tennis better, and the person say, well, I don't really want to play any better, you'd say, well, okay, well, you shouldn't try then. But if someone told a preposterous lie and you said to them, well, you should behave better, and they said, I don't want to behave better, you wouldn't just say, that, well, if you don't want to behave better, then there's no reason not to lie. The judgment of absolute value says, well, you have to, you should want to behave better. You should want not to lie, and that's this example of a judgment of absolute value. He also gives a example of what we mean by the right road. When we are talking about judgments of relative value, the meaning of the expression right road would just mean right road to go if you want to get to someplace quickest. Now, if we were, he says here on page 3, there's no sense in talking about the right road apart from such a predetermined goal. Now let us see what we could possibly mean by the expression the absolutely right road. I think it would be the road which everybody, on seeing it, would, with logical necessity, have to go or be ashamed for not going. And the implication here is that that's ridiculous. There's no such road. But when we talk about morality and we talk about people's duties and what they should do, what it would be morally good to do, we're invoking that idea that there's somehow a right thing to do. But because we can't actually translate it into facts, then our invocation of this idea of the absolute good or an absolute judgment of value really doesn't pay off. That is, it doesn't make any sense. It's not backed up by anything. After comparing the use of a judgment of absolute value with this notion of this metaphysical idea of wondering at the existence of the world, I think the key idea is introduced. When we say things like that, like I wonder that there is anything, I wonder that there is something rather than nothing, which is often taken to be the root metaphysical question. It may sound profound, but it's not. Why? Because you're misusing language. And just as you misuse language when you say something like you wonder at the existence of the world, you're misusing language when you say that something is good absolutely, or something is something you should do without any kind of conditions, without any kind of reservations, something you have an absolute duty to do. All of these things are a misuse of language. After reviewing other similar attempts to use language in this way, like in religion, he says this on page 5. Now, the 3 experiences which I have mentioned to you, and I could have added others, seem to those who have experienced them, for instance to me, to have, in some sense, an intrinsic absolute value. And there's where we go wrong. There's where, as he says, we're trying to use language in a way that we can't use it. We're trying to, if language, he says, is like a teacup, we're trying to pour a gallon into it. So what is ethics then? Well, here on the last page, he says, my whole tendency, And I believe the tendency of all men who ever tried to write or talk ethics or religion was to run against the boundaries of language. Language can express facts, but it cannot express some kind of absolute value to things, to actions, to people. He says it's like running against the walls of our cage, and it's perfectly hopeless. Ethics, so far as it springs from a desire to say something about the ultimate meaning of life, the absolute good, the absolute valuable, can be no science. That is, it can't be a rational enterprise. What it says does not add to our knowledge in any sense. And then he says that he respects it and wouldn't ridicule it, but he does say it does not add to our knowledge in any sense. When we try to make ethical or moral statements, we're basically speaking nonsense.